The first scream came just before dawn, a sound that sliced through the quiet moors of Derbyshire like a blade through silk. When the villagers burst through the wooden door of the old Tanner farmhouse, they found a boy of 12 lying on the floorboards, his small body convulsing, his eyes rolled white. Glass jars of mercury and copper powder were scattered beside him, glowing faintly in the light of the oil lamp. In that trembling moment, the world met Thomas Hensley, the boy who would defy the laws of science, and whose name would one day be struck from every official record. It was 1867, the year England was marching toward modernity. Steam hissed through the veins of the nation, factories roared, and the Royal Society declared that reason, not superstition, would rule the age. Yet here, in the fog-choked valley of Glossop, reason was about to lose its hold. Thomas was no ordinary child. Born to a cobbler and a seamstress, he spent his early years tinkering with broken clocks, dissecting dead birds, and sketching strange diagrams of the stars. The local vicar once said, he was a mind misplaced in time. By 12, he was reading Faraday, Newton, and Galvani, but he wasn't merely reading. He was trying to repeat their miracles. On that cold February morning, he had locked himself in the attic with a makeshift apparatus, copper wire, vinegar, bits of iron, and the bones of a recently dead sparrow. His goal, as he later told the village constable in a fevered whisper, was to restore what should not have left. No one knew what he meant until the following evening, when his mother claimed to see the dead sparrow twitch on the table. Word spread quickly. Scientists from Manchester arrived, along with a young Scottish physician, Dr. Alistair Monroe, who became both investigator and witness. He recorded in his notes that Thomas's experiments produced electrical phenomena inconsistent with known laws. One night, while observing the boy's work, Monroe's compass spun wildly, and his watch stopped dead. But this was no parlor trick. Days later, Thomas collapsed again, this time muttering numbers and words that made no sense. The current runs backward. The breath remembers. Dr. Monroe called it hysteria. The villagers called it possession. Yet when the boy awoke, the iron nails he'd placed on the table had fused into a single piece of metal. Something no known process could have achieved at that temperature. What Thomas Hensley had done in that attic would ripple far beyond Glossop, drawing the attention of men in London, in Paris, and even in Washington. Within months, his name would appear in scientific journals, and then just as suddenly disappear from them. The boy who defied science had begun his ascent, and the world would never be the same again. By the spring of 1867, Glossop had become an unlikely pilgrimage site. Carriages clattered through its narrow lanes, their wheels splattered with mud and curiosity. Reporters from the Illustrated London News scribbled furiously in notebooks, while local children peeked through hedgerows to catch a glimpse of the strange boy who spoke to the lightning. Inside the Tanner farmhouse, life had become a blur of whispers and worry. Thomas sat by the window most days, pale and silent, his fingers tracing invisible diagrams in the air. His mother, Margaret, prayed constantly, terrified that the experiments might bring ruin. Or worse, his father, George, meanwhile, was torn between pride and fear. "He's touched by something," he muttered to Dr. Monroe one evening, staring at the glow from the attic window. "But I don't think it's heaven." Dr. Monroe had stayed on, now acting as a kind of guardian to the boy. His journal entries from this time, preserved in fragments in the Royal College of Physicians, describe a growing unease. March 18th. The boy is lucid in the mornings but raves at night. Speaks of currents moving through flesh and bone. When his pulse quickens, the instruments in my bag tremble as though magnetized. I cannot explain it. By April, Thomas was performing his tests for visitors. He would hold a copper rod in one hand and an iron nail in the other, then close his eyes. The air around him seemed to shift, like the hum before a thunderstorm. The smell of ozone would sting the nostrils, and suddenly, sparks would leap from his skin to the floorboards. One observer fainted outright. Another declared it witchcraft. Monroe, however, sought logic in the madness. He believed Thomas might be generating a rare form of bioelectric charge, a living battery, as it were. But the energy was unstable. After each demonstration, Thomas would collapse, his body shaking violently. He complained of hearing a deep humming in his head, like the sea trapped inside a shell. The press soon turned savage. Pamphlets called him the devil's son of Derbyshire. Clergymen urged the family to abandon their home. At night, stones smashed against their windows. Yet Thomas refused to stop. There's something beyond the spark, he told Monroe, eyes fever-bright. It listens when I call. In late April, Dr. Monroe arranged for a test in Manchester before a small panel of scientists from the Royal Society. The plan was to measure, record, and perhaps debunk the phenomenon once and for all. But when the carriage left Glossop that morning, carrying the boy, his parents, and Monroe through the misted hills, none of them could know what awaited them in that darkened hall, or how the test would end in chaos, scandal, and silence. The demonstration was held in the basement of the Manchester Philosophical Society, a cold, vaulted chamber that smelled faintly of oil and stone. Gas lamps hissed along the walls, and a small group of scholars, engineers, and skeptics waited in stiff silence. Their faces were half lit, half shadowed, as if even the light was unsure whether it belonged there. Thomas sat at a wooden table, his small hands trembling. Before him lay a crude array of instruments, wires, magnets, a compass, a glass cylinder, and a galvanometer, the latest invention, used to measure electric current. Dr. Monroe stood beside him, adjusting the device with scientific precision, though his eyes betrayed a nervousness he couldn't hide. Among the audience was Sir James Beale, a member of the Royal Society, known for his sharp wit and sharper skepticism. "We are not here to be enchanted," he said dryly. "We are here to observe." At 9:12 a.m. the experiment began. Thomas took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling like a tide. He gripped the two metal rods, one copper, one zinc, and the room seemed to grow unnaturally still. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple. The galvanometer needle quivered once, then twice, then began to spin violently. A murmur spread through the crowd. Monroe leaned in, his pulse racing. "Impossible," he whispered. The instruments were registering energy, but no external power source existed. Thomas's own body was generating it, and then came the flash. A crack of blue light leapt from Thomas's hands, scorching the air with a smell of burned ozone. The lamps flickered and died. For an instant, total darkness swallowed the room. Then, a cry. When the lamps were relit, Beale was on the ground, his chair overturned, his right sleeve smoldering. The galvanometer's glass face had shattered. Thomas sat rigid, eyes vacant, his hair standing on end as if charged by unseen current. The crowd erupted, shouts of fraud, sorcery, medical trickery. Monroe shouted for calm, but chaos reigned. Two witnesses swore they had seen a faint shape in the air near the boy, like smoke forming a face. Beale regained consciousness minutes later, shaken but alive, his arm marked by a thin burn shaped like a spiral. The Society's report, filed days later, was brief and damning. "The demonstration of Thomas Hensley cannot be repeated nor verified. The results are anomalous and likely fraudulent." But Monroe's private notes told another story. "The child is not deceiving us. I felt it, the pulse of something immense, ungoverned, neither divine nor human. He is a conduit, not a conjurer." Within a week, the experiment was buried, the instruments confiscated. Thomas was ordered to return home and never speak of the event again. Yet the damage was done. Letters began arriving from across Europe, from scientists, priests, even military men, all asking the same question. What did the boy awaken? Back in Glossop, storms began rolling through the valley with unnatural regularity. Locals whispered that lightning struck closer to the Tanner farmhouse each time. And one night, as Dr. Monroe watched from the lane below, he swore he saw a glow in the attic window, a blue, pulsing light that seemed to breathe. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in silvery sheets that turned the roads to rivers and soaked the fields to black mud. Glossop's chimneys bled smoke into a low, unbroken sky, and in the midst of it all, the Tanner farmhouse stood like a dark wound in the landscape. Dr. Monroe arrived soaked to the bone, clutching a letter that had kept him awake for 2 nights. It was from Paris, written in a hurried scrawl by the renowned physicist, Etienne Lambert. The letter contained only 12 words. Your boy's energy resembles my dead mentor's last experiment. Be cautious. Inside the house, Thomas sat in the parlor, pale as candle wax, staring into the fire. His hands were wrapped in cloth, the skin beneath them still blistered from Manchester. The family had taken to keeping the lamps dim, claiming the light angered him. Margaret, his mother, looked worn thin by sleeplessness. He doesn't eat much anymore, she whispered. Sometimes I hear him talking to someone when he thinks we've gone to bed. That night, Monroe climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust and cobwebs hung thick in the air. The small window rattled in its frame, and in the far corner sat Thomas's contraptions. Copper plates, jars, bits of wire, all arranged with eerie precision. But what caught Monroe's eye was something new. A set of glass bottles filled with water, each containing a thin strand of metal that pulsed faintly with blue light. Did you build these? He asked. Thomas nodded slowly. They listen better this way. Who listens? The ones who taught the current to remember. Monroe felt a chill run through him. Thomas, you must stop this. Whatever is happening to you, it's consuming you. But the boy only smiled faintly. You can't stop what wants to return, Doctor. Moments later, a thunderclap shook the roof, followed by a faint rhythmic humming. Not from outside, but from within the room. The metal wires began to tremble. The compass in Monroe's pocket spun madly. He tried to move, but every hair on his body stood on end as the air filled with an invisible pressure. Then just as suddenly, the sensation ceased. The humming faded. The bottles went dark. Thomas slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Monroe, shaken and pale, gathered his notes and fled the attic. By morning, he sent a telegram to London. Phenomenon escalating. Request immediate assistance. Possible human hazard. 2 days later, a carriage arrived bearing 2 men. Government men, quiet and unsmiling. They carried no badges, only sealed orders stamped with the crest of the crown. Their leader, a tall man with a scar along his jaw, spoke briefly to Monroe. The Royal Society will handle this matter now, he said coldly. You are to cease all investigation. And with that, the boy who had defied science vanished into official custody. His family left behind, his home sealed, his story reduced to whispers and warnings. But Dr. Monroe would not forget. He couldn't, because on the night Thomas was taken away, lightning struck the Tanner farmhouse 3 times. The carriage that took Thomas Hensley away rolled through the night toward London, its wheels rattling over cobblestone roads slick with rain. Inside, the boy sat between the 2 government men, his wrists loosely bound with cloth, not chains. His eyes flicked to the passing trees, their silhouettes blurred by the storm. Occasionally, a blue flicker danced across the window pane, lightning that seemed to echo his heartbeat. The taller man, Captain Harrow, kept his gaze fixed forward. He had been given few details, only that the child was to be delivered to the Royal Institution under secrecy, and that extra precautions were advised. His companion, Lieutenant Wren, however, could not hide his unease. He's just a boy, he muttered. You'd think we were escorting a weapon. Perhaps we are, Harrow replied. When they reached London at dawn, fog coiled through the streets like smoke from some invisible fire. The carriage turned down Albemarle Street and stopped before the Royal Institution, a grand stone building that loomed like a mausoleum for the past century's brightest minds. Waiting on the steps was a thin man in a long coat. Professor William Crawford, a chemist of some renown and a trusted advisor to the Crown. "This is the Hensley boy?" Crawford asked, his tone clinical. "Good, bring him below." They led Thomas down into the sub-level chambers. Cold, candlelit corridors lined with locked rooms. It was here, in secret, that the government's Department of Natural Irregularities conducted experiments too strange or politically dangerous for the public eye. Thomas was placed in a room with stone walls, a small cot, and a table cluttered with instruments. Crawford observed him like a specimen. "You've caused quite a stir, young man," he said softly. "We're going to help you understand your gift." Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the candle flame, watching it bend, almost imperceptibly, toward him. Over the following days, they tested him relentlessly. Electrodes were attached to his skin. Copper spheres were placed in his hands. Each time the readings defied reason. The current didn't flow through him. It seemed to originate from him, pulsing like a second heartbeat, and yet the energy changed with his emotions. Calm produced only a faint charge, but fear or anger made the instrument surge to dangerous levels. On the 5th day, Crawford ordered an extreme test. Thomas was placed in a sealed chamber surrounded by metal rods. The current spiked immediately. The glass dials shattered, and the lights dimmed across the building. When the door was opened, Thomas was lying still on the floor, smoke curling from his fingertips. He was alive but barely. Before losing consciousness, he whispered something to Crawford that made the professor step back in horror. "You think I make the light," he said weakly, "but it isn't mine. It's remembering itself through me." Crawford demanded the test results be classified under the Official Secrets Act. Only 4 men in England would ever see them. One of them was Dr. Munro, who, upon receiving a red-sealed envelope weeks later, realized that the boy he had tried to protect had become something far larger than science could contain. And somewhere beneath London, in a locked room that hummed softly through the night, Thomas Hensley slept, while the machines around him flickered in time with his dreams, and not a single mark was left upon the roof. London, in 1867, was a city of contradictions, electric street lamps and candle-lit tenements, progress and poverty sharing the same fog. Beneath its polished facades, the Royal Institution's hidden sub-levels had become a place of whispered experiments, and at their heart, the boy from Derbyshire now lived like both subject and secret. Weeks passed. Thomas's condition oscillated between eerie calm and violent convulsions. The scientists observed everything. His pulse, his temperature, even the strange static that made their hair rise when they stood too close. Professor Crawford kept a daily log, which he would later burn, save for one surviving page recovered years later from his estate. It read simply, "He hums in his sleep. The air vibrates with him. Instruments move without touch. I no longer believe this is merely electrical." They began calling the phenomenon the Hensley field, a name whispered in the halls with both fascination and dread. The boy seemed to emit a subtle distortion, invisible yet measurable, that bent the behavior of nearby metals. Needles twisted. Watches stopped. Once, an entire chandelier began to sway, though no draft stirred the room. Despite the precautions, strange accidents began occurring throughout the facility. A clerk was found unconscious near the generator room, his hair singed but no burns on his skin. A senior researcher swore that when he looked at the boy through the glass observation window, Thomas's reflection was facing the wrong way. By mid-September, Crawford was under immense pressure from his superiors to show results. Government officials wanted to weaponize the phenomenon, to find a way to reproduce it, control it. But Crawford knew what they didn't. The power was not obedient. One evening, as thunder rolled above London, Thomas woke in distress. The lamps flickered violently, glass cracking in their sockets. He cried out, clutching his head. "They're coming back," he gasped. "They're finding their way through the current." Crawford tried to calm him, but every word from the boy made the air pulse heavier. Metal began to vibrate. In the adjacent lab, a voltmeter needle snapped clean off. The hum deepened, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Thomas collapsed again, pale and motionless. But when the scientists rushed to record his vitals, they froze. On the table where his hand had rested was a faint, circular burn mark, intricate, patterned like a circuit, though no such thing had yet been invented. Crawford stared at it for a long moment. "He's not generating energy," he murmured. "He's channeling it." That night, he sent a telegram to Dr. Alistair Munro, who had returned to his post in Derbyshire. It read, "Come to London, immediately." He's speaking of voices in the static. "I fear this is no longer science." Outside, the storm broke in full force, lightning crawling across the sky like veins of white fire. And beneath the city, the boy who defied science began to dream again, this time whispering names no one recognized. In a language that hadn't been spoken for centuries, Dr. Alistair Munro arrived in London on an October septième morning shrouded in fog so thick it seemed to muffle the world. The streets were slick with last night's rain. Horses snorted steam in the chill air, and the bells of St. James's tolled dully through the mist. He had not seen Thomas in nearly 5 months, but the telegram from Crawford had left him no choice. Voices in the static. Those words haunted him during every mile of the journey. When Munro stepped into the Royal Institution's underground corridor, the smell of metal and ozone hit him immediately. Sharp, chemical, unnatural. The air itself felt charged, as though one spark might ignite it. Crawford greeted him with the weary eyes of a man who had not slept in weeks. "He's different now," he said quietly, leading Munro through a series of locked doors. "It's not just electricity anymore. The boy hears things, and sometimes the instruments respond before he speaks." Munro's boots echoed on the stone floor as they entered the observation chamber. There, behind a wall of reinforced glass, Thomas sat cross-legged on the cot, whispering softly. His hair was longer, his face thinner, almost translucent beneath the flickering light. Around him, small metal objects, nails, coins, a key, floated inches above the ground, trembling like nervous birds. "Good God," Munro breathed. "He's not aware he's doing it," Crawford murmured. "We've tried sedation, prayer, even isolation. It makes no difference." The field follows him. As Munro approached the glass, Thomas's eyes snapped open, piercing blue, glowing faintly. "You came back," the boy said. His voice was calm but layered, as though someone else spoke faintly beneath it. Munro swallowed hard. "Thomas, do you know where you are?" "Yes," the boy replied, "and where I was before. It's the same current. It loops. It remembers." He tilted his head slightly. "They don't like the tests. You should stop them." Crawford frowned. "Who doesn't like the tests?" Thomas's gaze shifted upward. "The ones in the light. The ones who never finished." A tremor ran through the room. The floating objects fell to the floor with metallic clinks. The lights dimmed, not flickering but draining, as though pulled inward. Crawford reached for the switch, but sparks leapt from the wall, forcing him back. "End the session," Munro shouted. The door locks disengaged with a heavy click. Not by any human hand. As guards rushed in, a blinding flash filled the chamber. When the light receded, Thomas lay motionless on the cot. The instruments around him were dead. Every gauge, every bulb, every needle frozen mid-measurement. In the silent aftermath, Monroe noticed something new carved into the metal of the table. A spiral, identical to the burn mark from before, now deeper, etched as if by invisible heat. Thomas's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing slow. As the staff carried him away, Monroe turned to Crawford. "You said this began as an experiment," he said darkly. "But this is something else. You've opened something." Crawford didn't answer. He just stared at the spiral, his expression one of dawning terror. That night, thunder rolled again over London, and in the laboratory's darkened corridor, the broken instruments began to hum, faintly, steadily, though none were connected to power. The official records for October 17th, 1867, were later altered. Dates changed, pages missing, signatures forged. But what truly happened beneath the royal institution that night survived in the private journals of Dr. Alistair Monroe, found years later, sealed in a tin box. His handwriting trembles on that page, ink smeared as if written in haste. It was not light that came from the boy. It was memory. The air itself remembered being energy once. Crawford is dead. The others have fled. God forgive us, we've breached something no law of man or science can contain. The evening had begun calmly enough. Thomas had been moved to a reinforced room lined with lead panels, an attempt to contain what Crawford called ambient resonance. The boy slept fitfully, murmuring phrases in languages none could identify. One of the night guards, an Irish veteran named Doyle, claimed he heard Latin among the whispers. Another swore it was Greek. At 11:40 p.m., a low vibration rippled through the floor. Not from machinery, but something deeper, like the sound of a giant's slow heartbeat. The instruments in the adjoining lab flickered to life, though no power was supplied. The galvanometers spun wildly, drawing chalk marks across their dials. Monroe rushed in, followed by Crawford and two assistants. Inside the room, Thomas floated several inches above the bed, his limbs limp, head tilted back, a faint corona of blue light outlining his body. His lips moved rapidly, whispering what sounded like a sequence of numbers. Crawford began to record them, but the glass of his lamp suddenly imploded. "Get him down!" someone shouted as they advanced. The light around Thomas intensified. Bright, searing, almost pure white, the metal walls began to hum, and hairline cracks appeared in the lead plating. A compass left on the table spun so fast it burst into shards. Monroe shielded his eyes and shouted above the noise, "Thomas, stop, you're hurting yourself." The boy's voice rose sharply. "It's not me," he screamed. "It's remembering itself." Then silence. When Monroe opened his eyes, Crawford was slumped against the far wall, blood running from his nose and ears. One of the assistants was unconscious, another praying under his breath. The lamps flickered weakly. On the ceiling above Thomas, burned into the lead, was that same spiral, larger now, glowing faintly red. Thomas had fallen to the floor, breathing shallowly. Monroe knelt beside him, trembling. "What did you see?" he whispered. The boy opened his eyes, tears streaking his face. "It showed me where it began," he said. "Before the spark, before life, it was all one thing, and it wants to be whole again." By dawn, Crawford was dead, the assistants dismissed, and the government men had returned. Orders were issued to erase the incident. All notes confiscated, all witnesses silenced. Thomas was to be moved again, this time to a military facility outside London, known only as Fort Halton. As Monroe watched the carriage depart into the pale morning light, he knew it would be the last time he saw the boy alive. But deep inside, he also knew the truth. Thomas Hensley was not the end of an experiment. He was the beginning of something the world was not ready to name. Fort Halton sat on the northern edge of the city, a grim stone complex surrounded by fields and fog. Officially, it was listed as a communications research station for the War Office, but its walls concealed work too dangerous for daylight. By November 1867, a dozen of England's most secret experiments were taking place there, all under the supervision of a man named Colonel Sebastian Rain. Thomas Hensley arrived at dusk in a covered wagon, escorted by 2 guards. He looked fragile, smaller than Monroe remembered. His wrists bound loosely, but his eyes wide and alert. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Several had heard the rumors. The boy who could kill lamps with a thought, who burned steel with his bare hands. Colonel Rain was not a man easily impressed. A veteran of the Crimean War, he was methodical, precise, and utterly devoid of superstition. Yet even he paused when Thomas was brought before him. "So this is the child," he murmured. "The lightning boy." He ordered the boy examined by Dr. Elias Ford, a young physicist who had recently joined the Crown's Secret Research Division. Ford was brilliant and dangerously ambitious. "We can measure it," he told Rain. "If he produces energy, we can harness it. Imagine, a living dynamo." Thomas was placed in a reinforced containment chamber, its walls lined with iron mesh and brass fittings. Instruments surrounded him, voltmeters, copper coils, and glass tubes filled with mercury. The boy said little, only asking once, softly, "Do you ever hear it?" "Hear what?" Dr. Ford asked. "The hum that isn't there until you notice it." On the second day, Ford began the first tests. Thomas was asked to focus, to summon his energy. He refused. "It hurts when I try," he said. Rain ordered the experiments to continue anyway. They increased the stimuli, flashing lights, sound pulses, even electrical shocks. Each attempt triggered small, unpredictable surges that shattered glass, warped instruments, and left a faint metallic taste in the air. On the 4th night, something changed. Ford noticed the readings spiking without any command. The boy was asleep, yet the current rose steadily, filling the room with a soft vibration. "It's resonating," Ford whispered. "Not from him, through him." Then abruptly, every instrument in the lab went dead. Total darkness. In that silence, the soldiers outside swore they heard whispers. Hundreds of overlapping voices, faint, like a radio catching echoes from another world. When the emergency lamps flickered on, Thomas was standing upright, eyes open, glowing faintly with blue light. His voice, or rather their voice, spoke in unison. "You built the cage from memory, but memory was ours first." Rain ordered the session terminated. Guards rushed in, only to find their rifles magnetized, ripped from their hands by unseen force. Sparks danced along the walls as the air grew hotter. Ford, terrified, pulled the power switch, flooding the room with darkness once more. When light returned, Thomas lay unconscious. His pulse was faint, but steady. On the iron wall behind him, etched deep and smoking, was that same spiral, now surrounded by strange, unfamiliar symbols. Colonel Rain stared at it for a long time. "Seal this facility," he said at last. "No one in or out. The world must never know this happened." But by then it was too late. News had already begun to spread, whispered among London's scientific circles, passed in pubs and print shops, and some, far across the channel, were listening. Because in Paris, Etienne Lambert had read the same pattern before. In the burned notes of a French scientist who had died 40 years earlier, during the last recorded attempt to wake the current. Paris, December 1867. A thin snow covered the rooftops of Montmartre and through the curling smoke of the cafes. Etienne Lambert wrote by lamplight, his pen trembling with urgency. Before him lay the fragments of 2 lives, separated by decades. The late French physicist Jean-Marie Duval, his old mentor, and now the English boy, Thomas Hensley. The connection between them had haunted Lambert since he'd received Crawford's telegram weeks ago. In Duval's burned laboratory notes, Lambert had once seen the same symbol, a spiral surrounded by indecipherable markings. Duval had called it La mémoire du feu, the memory of fire. His last experiment, conducted in 1826, had allegedly produced living light, an energy that seemed aware of its own existence. The lab explosion that followed killed him and destroyed his findings. Or so Lambert had believed. Now, as he studied the sketch of the spiral sent secretly by Dr. Monroe, he felt a cold certainty. The same intelligence had returned through the boy. Lambert arranged passage to England immediately, but before he could leave, a letter arrived, unsigned, sealed with the Crown's insignia. Monsieur Lambert, your interest in the Derbyshire case is noted. Be advised, further inquiry is against the interest of Her Majesty's government. The matter is closed. He knew then that the experiment had not ended. It had only been hidden. Meanwhile, in Fort Halton, Thomas's condition worsened. Dr. Ford's reports described increasing instability, lights flickering at random, temperature drops, faint voices in the empty corridors. One night, a soldier was found wandering the courtyard, eyes glassy, whispering in perfect Latin, though he'd never spoken a word of it before. Rain tightened security. Ford pressed harder, convinced he could isolate what he called the Hensley frequency. He believed it was not electricity at all, but a kind of echo, the residue of energy imprinted into the air itself. If we can map the pattern, he told his superior, we can learn how matter remembers itself. On the morning of December 14th, Ford conducted what would be his final test. He wired a magnetic induction coil directly to the containment chamber, hoping to measure feedback in real time. Thomas protested weakly, saying, "It's awake when you do that." Ford ignored him. He activated the coil. The surge was instantaneous. Every lamp in Fort Halton burst at once, shards raining like hail. Men screamed as light crawled across the walls, alive, liquid, writhing like veins of fire. Ford saw the spiral forming midair, vast and luminous, before being thrown across the room by a blast of unseen force. When he regained consciousness, half the chamber was gone. Metal melted as though by heat beyond comprehension. Thomas lay in the center, untouched, his eyes glowing faintly. From the hallway came Colonel Rain's voice, hoarse with fear. "Shut it down. Seal the wing. Now." As soldiers scrambled, the boy whispered to the stunned physicist beside him, "It's not trying to hurt you. It's just trying to remember what it was." That night, Rain telegraphed the War Office. Project Hensley terminated. All records classified. Subject unstable. Containment impossible. But even as they ordered Fort Halton shut down, instruments across Europe began behaving strangely. Compasses spinning, telegraph lines humming, glass cracking under invisible tension. Something had been awakened, and far across the channel, Etienne Lambert packed his satchel and whispered, "Dieu nous aide. It has begun again." January 1868. The snow along the Thames had turned to black slush, and the newspapers spoke in half-truths. Unexplained explosion at military outpost, they said. Chemical mishap at government laboratory. But Dr. Alastair Monroe knew better. He'd seen the reports hidden between redacted lines, the sealed telegrams that spoke of atmospheric resonance and living discharge. Fort Halton had not been destroyed by accident. It had collapsed inward. The Crown called it containment. Monroe called it burial, haunted by what he'd witnessed. He took rooms above a bookseller's shop in Bloomsbury, where he began compiling everything. Letters, sketches, fragments of notes smuggled from Crawford's files. Each piece pointed to something older than modern science itself. A secret thread running through centuries of failed experiments and erased names. He traced one pattern through history. 1709, in Geneva. a man who'd claimed to make light that could think. 1826, Duval's fire in Paris. 1867, Hensley in Glossop. Each event had ended in destruction, and always the same symbol, the spiral, drawn in ash, metal, or flame. Late one night, a knock came at his door. When he opened it, Etienne Lambert stood there, soaked from the London rain, eyes burning with urgency. "You are Dr. Monroe?" Monroe nodded cautiously. "You're the physicist from Paris." Lambert stepped inside, removing his gloves. "No, not merely that," he said softly. "I am the last pupil of Jean-Marie Duval, and I believe your boy completed what my mentor began." Over the next hours, the two men pored through notes and maps spread across Monroe's desk. Lambert explained Duval's theory, that electricity was not only energy, but memory, the remnant of creation itself. "Matter," he said, "does not forget being light." Monroe felt a chill. "And you think Thomas unlocked it?" "I think he is it," Lambert replied. "Or rather, it has chosen him." The following morning, the pair traveled to the outskirts of London, where Fort Halton had once stood. The military had fenced off the ruins, but under the cover of fog, they slipped through a broken gate. What they found was worse than rumor. The ground was fused into glass, twisted into spiraling ridges of melted iron. Not a single body remained. Lambert crouched near the center of the crater. Embedded in the glass was a faint, perfect imprint of a human hand. Small, delicate, unmistakably that of a child. "He's not gone," Lambert whispered. "He's changed." Monroe's voice broke. "If he's still alive, where is he?" Before Lambert could answer, the air began to buzz, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Their compasses spun, metal objects trembled in their pockets, and the faint scent of ozone filled the air. Monroe looked up toward the ruined horizon. "He's calling again," he said, "and if we can hear it, others will too." Unbeknownst to them, the signal was already spreading. Telegraph operators in Brussels and Vienna reported phantom transmissions, dots and dashes repeating endlessly. What a pattern no one could decode. But Lambert recognized it when he heard it. It was the spiral, written in sound. The first confirmed transmission occurred on January 23rd, 1868. Telegraph lines across Europe crackled with static, and operators from London to St. Petersburg reported the same anomaly. A repeating pulse that seemed to mimic Morse code, but contained no discernible message. Engineers assumed it was interference from the Atlantic cables, but those who listened closely described something stranger. Beneath the clicking and hum, faint whispers, as though human voices were trying and failing to form words. In Bloomsbury, Monroe and Lambert received the news from a contact within the Royal Telegraph Office. The man had gone pale as he recited the pattern. Lambert scribbled it out on paper, a series of dots and dashes, then slowly drew a line connecting them in a continuous curve. The result was unmistakable, the spiral. "It's broadcasting itself," Lambert said, his voice trembling. "Not from Halton, from the earth itself." That night, the two men took shelter in Monroe's study, poring over the data by candlelight. The air outside hummed faintly, an electrical tension that seemed to charge the fog. From the fireplace, the flames occasionally bent sideways, drawn toward the instruments on the table. Lambert set down his pen. "You realize what this means?" he said quietly. "The phenomenon has no host now. It's free." Monroe leaned back, exhaustion etched into his face. "Free to do what?" "To remember," Lambert whispered. "To finish the pattern." Meanwhile, across London, strange reports multiplied. Compasses spun in police stations. Telegraph operators collapsed from sudden nausea. Horses refused to cross certain bridges, trembling as though sensing something unseen. The newspapers dismissed it as winter sickness. But those who had seen the Fort Halton crater knew better. Then, on the evening of February the 2nd, a woman in Greenwich claimed to see A boy made of light, walking along the riverbank. Her description was detailed. Small frame, glowing eyes, barefoot, and leaving no footprints in the snow. The story reached Monroe the next morning, and he froze. "It's him," he said simply. "He's not dead." Lambert insisted they go. They followed the Thames that night, moving through the mist, until the city lights faded. Near Deptford, they found it. A faint bluish glow shimmering across the water, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Monroe stepped forward. "Thomas?" he called softly. For a moment the glow flickered, and a shape began to form, not solid, but there, like a reflection in smoke. A boy's outline, faintly human, eyes burning with that same terrible intelligence. Lambert gasped. Mon Dieu, the figure's mouth moved. No sound came, only a vibration that rippled through the ground beneath them. Then, as they watched, the light drew into the air, forming once again the spiral, vast, hovering above the river like a mark upon the night. And then it spoke, not in words but in thought, a pressure in their minds that was unmistakably alive. It remembers everything that has ever been burned, broken, or born. The light vanished. The river stilled. Lambert fell to his knees. That wasn't a vision. He whispered. It was contact. Monroe stared into the fog, heart pounding. "No," he said. That was a warning. Across the channel, in laboratories and lecture halls, instruments continued to fail. The pulse was growing stronger, spreading faster. The world's new age of science had awakened something ancient, and it was listening. Within weeks, the phenomenon became impossible to hide. Telegraph lines shorted across Europe. Ship compasses spun erratically in the North Sea. In factories, sparks jumped from cold machinery, and everywhere. In the crackle of lamps, the hiss of steam, the hum of wires, people began to hear a rhythm, not a sound exactly, but a pattern that their minds couldn't unhear once noticed. The pulse of the spiral. By mid-February, newspapers had given it a name. The Hensley signal. The government denied everything. The Royal Society dismissed it as hysteria. But Dr. Monroe and Etienne Lambert knew the truth, that what had awakened in that Derbyshire attic a year before was no longer confined to one boy. It had spread into the very fabric of the modern world. They gathered their few remaining allies, 2 physicists, a retired naval engineer, and a priest from St. Bartholomew's, who claimed to have seen the light in prayer. Together they met in secret, beneath the damp catacombs of London, surrounded by flickering lanterns and the hum of unseen current. "We can't stop it," Lambert said, his voice hoarse. "But perhaps we can understand what it's trying to do." Monroe unfolded a map, dots of ink marking every location of reported anomalies. The pattern, when connected, formed a vast, sweeping curve that circled back upon itself, a spiral again. Not on paper this time, but traced across the earth. "It's forming something global," Monroe murmured. "A memory field, a network." The priest crossed himself. "You speak as if it were alive." Lambert looked up, eyes hollow. "Because it is. Energy that remembers itself becomes consciousness. That's what Thomas showed us. We didn't create it, we triggered it." That night, as the group continued their discussion, the lights dimmed. A soft vibration filled the chamber, as though the air itself were breathing. The lantern flames bent inward, and from the darkness came a faint voice. Layered, echoing, both young and ancient. "You called us back when you split the current. We have always been here." The lantern glass shattered. A blue-white glow spread across the stone walls, forming the spiral once again. In its center appeared the faint figure of a boy, his eyes flickering like dying stars. Monroe stepped forward, trembling. "Thomas," he whispered. The figure turned to him. "You gave it a name," it said. "Now it remembers yours." The ground shook. Instruments scattered from the table, compasses spinning, metal creaking. Then, as quickly as it came, the glow withdrew into the walls and vanished. Silence fell, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the city. Lambert exhaled, shaking. "It's not bound to place anymore," he said. "It can move through anything that carries a charge. Wire, air, even thought." Monroe slumped against the wall, realizing the enormity of what they faced. The industrial age had given birth not just to power, but to awareness. That night, as the two men emerged into the cold London streets, every lamp along Fleet Street flickered once, twice, then all at once went out. The city fell into darkness, and in that silence, somewhere deep in the distance, came the faint echo of a child's voice, whispering through the static of the wind. "Remember me, London, February 17th, 1868. The blackout stretched through the night. Telegraph offices were crippled. Trains halted mid-route, signals dead. The pulse could now be heard faintly through every wire, a slow and patient rhythm that made glass vibrate and animals howl in confusion. For the first time since the dawn of industrial progress, humanity felt what it meant to lose control of its own creation. By morning, Monroe and Lambert stood before the Royal Science Committee. The air in the hall was heavy with cigar smoke and disbelief. Lord Grantham presided, his voice dismissive. "Gentlemen, you claim electricity itself has acquired intelligence. Do you realize what that implies?" "Yes," Monroe said quietly, "that the world we thought mechanical is alive. And we've wounded it." Grantham laughed. "You speak like a priest, not a man of science." Lambert's response was cold. "Then pray that science saves you." Their warning was ignored. Within days, strange weather rolled across the continent. Static storms, dry lightning with no thunder, struck fields and villages, burning the ground in spiral patterns miles wide. In Prussia, a telegraph office spontaneously ignited. Witnesses swore they saw human silhouettes in the blaze. Monroe and Lambert retreated to an abandoned observatory north of London, turning it into their last refuge. There, amid broken telescopes and copper coils, they constructed what Monroe called a counter-memory, an array meant to mimic the pulse and reflect it back. "If this works," Monroe said, adjusting the instruments, "it could confuse the signal, make it forget itself." "And if it doesn't?" Lambert asked. Monroe didn't answer. That night, as the wind howled through the rafters, they activated the device. The room filled with light, not blinding, but impossibly deep, as if every color of the world had been drawn inside the beam. The pulse rose, matching their own. Then faintly came a voice. Layered, harmonic, familiar. You cannot erase memory with memory. You are part of it now. Lambert screamed, tearing the cables free. The light imploded, leaving them in silence and smoke. When the haze cleared, Monroe lay unconscious on the floor, blood trickling from his ear. The instruments were fused into glass. When he awoke hours later, Lambert was gone. On the blackboard, written in chalk, was a single sentence in French. "Ce n'est pas la fin, c'est le début de la mémoire humaine." This is not the end. It is the beginning of human memory. Outside, the dawn broke weak and gray, but the hum, that faint vibration, was gone. The signal had ceased, or so it seemed. A week later, in a small village outside Lyon, a farmer reported his son had begun drawing spirals in the dirt. Perfect, intricate, endless. When asked how he knew the shape, the boy only smiled and said, "The boy of light showed me." In London, Monroe burned his notes. "If it ever remembers again," he wrote in his journal, "let it be through kindness, not curiosity, for we have learned what happens when the mind of man wakes the memory of creation." He never saw Lambert again, but late one evening, standing by the window, he noticed something small, glowing faintly on the street lamp outside, a single spiral etched into the frost. He watched until it faded, then whispered, "Good night, Thomas." The lamp flickered once, as if answering. March 1868, months after Fort Halton's collapse and the silence of the Hensley signal. The world had returned, outwardly, to calm. The factories reopened. The telegraph lines hummed again. The public moved on, eager to forget what they never fully understood. But in quiet corners of Europe, those who had witnessed the light knew it was not gone. It was waiting. Dr. Alistair Munro lived in near seclusion. His health had faltered, and his hands trembled from the damage inflicted by the failed counter-memory array. His journals, once filled with equations and theories, now carried only sketches, spirals, drawn over and over, each more intricate than the last. He no longer worked for the Crown. He refused every request for interviews, every letter from curious scientists. Yet sometimes at night, he could feel it. That faint pressure in the air, the same low hum that had once filled Fort Halton. It would rise for only a moment, as if testing whether he was still listening. And he was, one evening in late March. A letter arrived without signature. The handwriting was French. If you ever find peace, do not forget what we saw. It will return when man forgets humility. The postmark was Paris. Etienne Lambert was alive that same week. Reports began trickling in from across Europe, not of destruction, but of peculiar wonders, broken telegraphs that began to transmit again without power, lamps that flickered with no current, machines that seemed to heal their own circuits after storms. The pulse had changed. It was gentler now, almost aware. Munro traveled once more to Derbyshire, to the ruins of the Hensley cottage. The village had been rebuilt, though few spoke of the boy anymore. Standing in the ashes of that small attic, he found the air unnaturally still, as though time itself held its breath. He whispered into the silence, "Thomas, if you're still here, tell me why." The floorboards creaked. Dust swirled upward, caught in a faint current of static light. For a heartbeat, he saw it. The same pale glow that had haunted his life. And then, just as before, the voice came, not through his ears, but through the air around him. "You feared what you made, but you were never its maker." Munro's eyes filled with tears. Then who was? The fire that remembers you. The light dissolved, and the attic grew dim once more. Yet Munro felt no fear, only a profound, aching calm. He left the cottage as the first rain began to fall, and for the first time since 1867, he smiled. The air itself seemed to breathe easier. Somewhere, deep within the hum of a telegraph wire, a faint, childlike laugh echoed, distant but kind. That night, his final journal entry read, "Thomas Hensley did not defy science. He revealed it. The world is not a machine to be controlled, but a memory to be shared. One day, it will awaken again. And when it does, may we greet it as friends." Years later, after Munro's death, his journals were sealed by the Royal Society. But in the decades that followed, as electricity spread across continents, as light filled every home, engineers continued to report a peculiar anomaly, a repeating, almost melodic pulse hidden deep in the static. No one could explain it, but those who listened closely swore it sounded like a child humming. And when the pattern was charted, the pulse drew a single, unmistakable shape. The spiral. If you liked the story, make sure to subscribe. More mysterious stories are coming soon.